Chasing Leviathan is a podcast about pursuing truth, one big question at a time through the discipline of listening. Truth is too big to tame, but if we pay close attention, we might get the chance to glimpse something truly magnificent. So please join me in this pursuit, 1 week at a time. Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Wehry, and I'm here today with Dr. Justine Murison, and we're here to talk about her book, Faith and Exposure, Privacy and Secularism in the 19th-Century United States. I'm really excited to talk about today's very timely topic. Dr. Murison, wonderful to have you on today.
Thank you for having me, PJ.
So, a normal question to start out with, why this book? Why did you feel like this is what I want to write? And then why does it fit our times?
Well, let me start with the first question. My first book was on the sort of cultural understanding of the nervous system in the 19th century. And it was very medical and literature and sort of thinking about how a sort of understanding of the sort of invisible but material aspects of how our bodies knit together and knit into the environment really transformed how people talked about community, how they created literature. One of the things that I saw dogging a lot of the doctors and a lot of the conversations around the nervous system was accusations of atheism. Like, you're destroying the soul or the concept of the soul by making it actually material, something in the body, electrical impulses going through your nerves. And so I was curious about how these accusations of atheism played out in a time when we start to think about the disestablishment of state churches. And, it's both the Second Great Awakening, but it's also the sort of secularization of America. And that's where it started. And that's you can see the elements of that, especially in the first chapter of the book that is on accusations of infidelity against Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, and the literature at the time really being obsessed with this sort of conspiracy thinking around deism and the Illuminati and after the French Revolution. But what I realized very quickly was that the story wasn't actually about that. The story was about privacy and privatization. And as I did more research, I realized the disestablishment of state churches, which in the United States, we often pose that culturally as the sort of quintessential definition of the secular state is the separation of church and state, the idea that there's a wall, as Thomas Jefferson put it, separating church and state. But what I was realizing was that not only were the fights really interesting around it, but the idea of where religion belonged transformed the whole culture. If religion belongs in the private sphere, what does that mean for privacy? How does that imbue privacy with religious and moral functions? The other direction for how this book took shape had a lot to do with the fights. I grew up after Roe v. Wade. Right. And my whole life, right, has been a fight about abortion. And one of the things I did know is that, especially Griswold v. Connecticut, the 1965 case that established the right to privacy, or the sort of gave us the language of the penumbra that in the Bill of Rights that adds up to the right to privacy, that language around privacy, reproduction, marriage, birth control, that's animating late 20th and early 21st century United States was really disconnected with a lot of the literature or scholarship I was seeing on privacy in the 19th century, which, especially a sort of more traditional or older version was always about being left alone or being in solitude. A sort of transcendental version of privacy, or the separate spheres theories around the private sphere, but these things weren't connecting together. So language about privacy today and language about privacy then, I could see a long trajectory as I started to work more and more on the project. And I should say that I finished even the epilogue and through page proofs before the Dobbs decision happened, that overturned Roe v.
Oh,
Wade. But I could see it coming. I could see it coming,
yeah,
especially,
yeah.
with the court's shadow docket ruling on Texas's SB 8. I mean, we all could kind of see it coming. But I had on my mind those things. I also had on my mind the erosion of privacy in social media. So I think that the present concerns were reverberating for me backward into the 19th century.
Forgive me. What does penumbra mean?
Oh, penumbra means shadow. It's a
Okay, awesome. Yeah.
yeah. It has always been since Douglas wrote that majority opinion in Griswold. It's been a controversial claim because for for people who were more on the sort of conservative legal side, especially originalists, maybe textualists, penumbra, and it's sort of like the Bill of Rights shadows forth a theory of privacy, but doesn't use the word privacy. I think my book sort of answers why, which is that privacy is this emerging concept. It doesn't really take its like full sort of language and form. It takes the 19th century to do that, but it's not. I think he's right. It's in the Bill of Rights. It's implied in no quartering of soldiers or no self-incrimination, right? This is all about sort of a sense of an inviolable private self, as Warren and Brandeis would put it later in the century.
As you're talking here, you mentioned privacy as like a transcendental form of transcendentalist form of loneliness. What do you think about would privacy as autonomy would be a good way to talk about the 20th century? Like there is that. And so, okay, you're nodding your head. So it seems like I'm on the right track. What is that switch, and why is that switch important?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that the bigger story is the rise of liberalism, right? This idea, and I mean liberalism with a small L, this idea that we are liberal subjects that own ourselves, that enter into contracts, that make choices. The sort of rise of liberalism and individualism that happens in the 19th century. I mean, it starts in the 18th, but really for U.S. culture, it really takes hold in the 19th century. Um, and so you get that autonomous subject out of an idea of liberalism. But one of the things that my book really pays attention to is how that movement changed marriage, and the sort of quintessential metaphor of the private sphere is the married couple, especially the heterosexual married couple. And I think that like the privatization of religion and the privatization of marriage are happening concurrently. And the privatization of marriage is all about changing marriage from a public function to a private contract. So it is about not just the individual oneself alone in the world, but about the contractual relations that are replacing sort of more publicly oriented, community-based theories of what, say, a marriage does, or where a family is demarcated and where a family is not demarcated. Um, I would say that there's I mean, I think privacy is important. Maybe it makes me a liberal subject, in liberalism, but I think that it's not just autonomy. It's a shielding of your life from corporate or government intrusion, right? Or surveillance. I think right now the fact that we have all sort of given the keys away to like what we're doing quietly in our house, I'm more concerned about the corporations having it, but that sense of what uh, you know. Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, right? This idea of making money off of watching us and keeping track of what we're doing. But I would say that my other concern about it, and the argument I make in the book, is that the opposite of privacy is not publicness so much as secrecy. And I think
Mm.
that, when we talk about the right to privacy, I think for some people it means the right to keep secrets from prying eyes. But I also think that privacy, because it has this public function, that it's emblematized by a marriage, that one of the things that I think a lot of our pitched battles around what I think is not not called correctly, but cultural issues, um, is about people having the right to privacy in the terms of not having to have their lives be secret. So if you think about that in terms of, say, gay marriage, right, that sense that you can have an official private life. I know that sounds contradictory, but that you don't have to keep it secret, right? Or the same thing with, say, abortion, right? That you have the right to have one. It doesn't have to be a secret sin. It's counterintuitive to think about privacy and secrecy that way, as opposed to those being in the same category, opposed to publicness. But I really do think that privacy assumes a level of openness and transparency, at least in how a liberal society has built it.
Immediately, I think of this metaphor, and I just want to make sure we're on the same track. Maybe this is helpful. For me, I immediately think of the difference between camouflage and offense,
Mm,
right? Like you
yeah,
have the difference between hiddenness
yeah,
and a boundary,
yeah,
right? And we actually do feel this with like, it's not legally held, but we feel that it's wrong for someone to, like a guy's. I read about a case where a guy was watching birds and he was looking over someone's fence with binoculars, right?
right,
But it's not that you can't look like that's a little creepy.
yeah,
Like not a little creepy. It's very creepy. Excuse me, very creepy. I'm not like, yeah, I mean, it's not too bad. No, it's very creepy. But you can look over someone's fence and it's not a big deal. Like you're just walking by. Like no one's gonna be like, how dare you look
right,
over my fence? But what's going on over in their fence? Unless it's a like obviously if you see someone dragging like a murdered body, like that's a different thing, right? But for the most part, you're looking over in someone's fence, you're like, that's theirs. That is, if for instance you have a high fence and you look over and someone is sunbathing in the nude and you're like, oh, and you're like, well, you shouldn't have looked over the fence, like that was on you, right? Like that's that's their private property, right? And so that's privacy as a boundary versus like, oh, I have to keep it. I mean, you're teaching on. You told me earlier the Scarlet Letter. Like tomorrow, and it's like, oh, I have to camouflage my sin, right? You have the sin in secret versus I actually had this written down to talk about versus the privacy in public,
yeah,
right? It's like, well, this is mine, and you can't come in here because this is something I need to take care
yeah.
of, like, and that you really shouldn't. And I there's some, I don't know how far you want to go into, but like, there's a lot about like metaphysical claims and like people getting to decide metaphysical claims, like really, you can't avoid metaphysical claims when you talk about what the good life is,
Right.
right? And so allowing people to, I mean, this is where it cuts into, not cuts into, this is where it dovetails with religion, right? Religion makes a lot of claims of what the good life is. There's a lot of other ways to make
Hmm.
claims about the good life, but it's that's what a lot of this is about, is allowing people to discover their own good life, and that's the whole idea of the pursuit of happiness, um ostensibly, right? Like, I mean, there's some, it gets I realize it gets
Yeah,
complicated,
yeah.
but am I in the right, like, is that a way to talk about it?
I think so. I think it's one of the jokes I always make at the beginning of talking about this is that I decided to write about two abstractions, privacy and secularism. So I always have to make it
Good.
more material. I
Right, right.
I think that because privacy, I think, has the positive qualities of allowing you to shield yourself, allowing you to sort of develop a sense of I don't know if I want to say autonomy, but selfhood that doesn't necessarily always have to report. Um, I think that one of the weird things that in our culture is that our sense of privacy always has to report. And I think that that's where my hope for privacy and what we actually do, I think, and that's where I think the term that's most important to the study, other than the term in the title, is authenticity. This idea that your private self is deeply who you are and who you're showing the world. very romantic notion that you're showing the world your real self, but I don't think it's gone away. I think actually this is one of the sort of like vestiges of romanticism that never got sort of pushed aside, this idea that like who I am needs to sort of be apparent, and that I'm doing anything from a faux pas to a major sin in not being true to who I am in my deep down self privacy, right? And maybe it's because Freud came along and kind of doubled down on this sort of idea of this deep self, but that sense that who you are is a private person, and then you go out into the public. That's the romantic story, and that like the goal is to be as much yourself as possible. And as I say in the book, like we learn that through our cultural modes. And so I'm a literary scholar, like we're talking history, we're talking theory, but I very much believe that how we think about ourselves isn't something we discover within. It's the stories that are circulated. It's the way in which you consume media and what you're consuming. Um, and for the 19th century, that's novels. They're hitting their like moment culturally. I mean, people are reading poetry. People love poetry too. I'm not trying to make novels the exclusive thing people are dieting on, but it is the way in which people shape the stories they tell about themselves is through these novels that are constantly posing revelations about characters, and then the long arc is who's the villain, or who's the bad person. Villain is often too strong a word, it's very melodramatic, but like how do we know Jaffrey Pingen's the big bad in House of Seven Gables is, it's right there on, how Hawthorne's describing him. But that you start to read other people that way, but you also start to read yourself that way. So I really do think that understanding that sort of history of the novel as emerging alongside liberalism and modernity is thinking about the novel's form as well as just fun stories people like to read, and that gives us a clue into the culture. But it really gives us a clue into how people perceive themselves and how they like interacted with each other, and then how they sort of rewrote law based on sort of how we think about our true selves. In a lot of ways, social media kinda does that now, right? I mean, how many times have I caught myself, before Twitter sort of came apart, another thing I couldn't have possibly expected when I wrote that epilogue. Um, but that sense that I would walk around and think, "Oh, I should write that as a tweet," like, it shaped how I thought about, like, myself interacting with the world, like, Facebook posts, like, how might I put that on Facebook? How might I present myself to the world?
Yeah, what kind of TikTok do I want to make? Yeah,
Exactly,
no, for
exactly.
sure. I want to return because this is really fascinating to me, and I always know there's a reason for it. You wanted to say something about selfhood versus autonomy. Why that distinction?
Oh, no, I think I would say they're both selfhood. I was saying authenticity, not versus autonomy. I would say probably authenticity as an expression of autonomy, or a way of
Okay.
imagining the autonomous self that is also constantly presenting itself to the world. Um, I'm not quite making that quite clear, because I think I'm thinking of autonomy in that liberal tradition, the selfhood that owns itself. When I think about authenticity, I'm thinking more in line with like a romantic notion of a true self, um this thing that you want to be true to, and thinking about, say, like Emerson's self-reliance, right? The voice you hear in solitude, that's your true self, and then the culture is trying to shape you into something else. um, that idea that there is even an originary moment where there's a true self, and then you go into culture and you hear these things. That would be my argument with Emerson. But that sense that like that idea that there's this authentic autonomous self inside you, that's a romantic notion, and made extremely popular by somebody like Emerson. um, for our culture, especially for our 21st century culture, as Emerson became, I don't think he holds this place anymore, but he did for a long time in the 20th century United States, this like quintessential American voice.
So this is again just like making sure that I'm on track with you. When you talk about autonomy, we're talking about that fence, we're talking about that boundary, and it's about being able to, and it's an important part of being authentic that you can establish yourself, right? That you can own yourself. I mean, goes back to even the Lockean idea of like
It
the
does.
first rule of property is I own myself, right? But authentic is different because you can still be false to yourself even within that boundary.
Exactly.
So the authenticity is different because it also demands of you that you are honest with yourself in order to like fulfill that boundary properly. Is that a fair way to
It
distinguish?
is, and the only way you can prove that you're being true to yourself is if you're performing it publicly. Like, it can't
Mm,
just be alone, like, this is why the compulsion on social media to constantly perform oneself is about that sense of, like, wanting to show your opinion, your authentic self. Um, I can be in my house and be my authentic self, but that doesn't really do the work of proving it's authentic. Um, I would say also, this is all complicated by the fact that as two of the chapters deal with, I'm working in the era of slavery, so owning yourself is an
big
incredibly
deal.
big deal and a privileged position as it is now. But that sense that you know, eh, this is where the paradoxes start coming into as I discovered, and this is where we get really abstract, right? This idea that privacy is always has this publicness to it, that it has this, in the US, culturally, historically, it has something to prove.
When you talk about and I'm just curious when you talk about social media and this constant proving your authentic self. Do you see that continuous proving as a good thing or a bad thing?
Oh, that's a great point. I mean, and now I'm going way off track with my book, but I would say that I think it's a bad thing.
Okay, okay. But in order to be authentic, you do have to prove it publicly.
Yeah.
But so
Well,
what
I
makes
think that
so go ahead.
I think I don't act I mean, like, I think if we're going down to brass tacks, I'm probably a dyed-in-the-wool Foucauldian. I don't think that we have authentic selves. I think the authenticity is a performance precisely because it's what the culture is demanding of us. I would say, I mean, part of my reason with, like, social media being such a treacherous place is the every time you're responding, you're like, I'm emotionally angry, I'm outraged, I'm gonna click on this, I'm gonna respond, I'm gonna retweet. You're feeding the thing that's actually selling your data to corporations. So I mean, for me, it's like a capitalist critique. But I would
Gotcha.
say also that the drive to do that always opens one up to all of, again, the swirl of accusations around if you're being authentic. Or are you just being a hypocrite? These things go together. And I think it creates a very toxic environment. Um, and I think that's where maybe you might have found my most romantic, if also my most anti-capitalist sort of strain, where I actually give my students what I call the Transcendentalist Challenge in the survey class, American Lit to 1865, where it's an extra credit assignment, but they have to unplug and then write about it. We used to say 24 hours, but that seemed way too long these days. And I always tell them they better tell all of their like family that they're not going to respond to texts, for like 3 hours, say. Um, but I want them to sort of do what Emerson or Thoreau is talking about, which is having the original relationship to the universe. And I mean that not in that highfalutin way, but just in a, do you walk across campus and are you always piping music into your ears? Are you able to have dinner without taking a picture of your dinner, to post somewhere? Like that sense that is your sort of the space between your ears and your whole like sort of private life, meals, friends, going out, even having a drink, like are all of these things caught up with showing other people that you're doing it? Or mediating the experience instead of actually just sitting, and I think that's hard, right? We're a very impatient culture at this point, but that's the challenge part, but it's also, um, I think they also this generation really kind of loves it. I think they're sort of really interested in alternative ways of thinking about technology, social relations. They're scared, they're anxious, but they're also sort of more open, about it. So it's been kind of interesting. I'll let you I'll let you know how that goes. This is the third time I'm doing the Transcendental Challenge. It was easy during COVID. They were like, "Yeah, got it, solitude."
Yeah, I'm out. Yeah. Um, so, forgive me, I didn't catch it. You said you're a dyed-in-the-wool what?
Foucauldian, Michel Foucault.
Oh,
Yeah,
yes. Okay.
yeah,
Tracking.
yeah. I really do think that, like, who we are is sort of, like, built, through these sort of, like, regulatory, disciplinary, biopolitical regimes. I'd like to think that, there's also a core, but, there's this sense in which it's hard to access. I mean, that's Freud's point too, right? We are strangers to ourselves. This thing that might be sort of deep down is not gonna be, like, necessarily revealed easily. It's gonna bubble up in weird ways. Um, but I just think that we're more weird and we're more structured by our environment than I think, like, liberal philosophy would admit.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you're talking to, yeah, my background's philosophical hermeneutics. So there's a strong bent towards phenomenology and psychology. And so, yeah, that, yeah, very, very familiar. And also, yeah, this idea that we are these kind of just blocks to ourselves, that we are, like, when we say autonomous, the boundaries are strong. I don't, anyways,
Yeah.
that's a
I mean,
whole
I
nother
even think
discussion though.
bodily, like even our bodies don't have that kind of strong boundary, let alone our selfhood.
Right.
I think that, like, this
Uh,
is also where I always pull things, back to the material, but I also talk it in terms of stories and literature because if I if I am being sort of constructed outside of myself to think I have this authentic self, what am I consuming that creates that feeling? You know, how am I learning it? And I think that, different people come at that question differently, but I am always thinking about what's popular in reading, what books are people consuming, what television shows are they watching, that kind of thing. And you can really track how culture changes through that. And then how people think about culture changes too.
well, when you look at, so for me, I started out with a love of literature. Like, I read like a crazy man when I was a kid. And the reason I went into philosophy was not like, there's a reason it's a big questions podcast and not a philosophy podcast. And that, like, philosophy for me was a way of talking about, it was very clear that when we read fiction, we are learning something and we are growing as people. And a lot of the philosophy I encountered, this is why I ended up in hermeneutics, but a lot of the philosophy I did encounter was not able to account for that. It's just like, well, and it's like, this is very attractive to people, and just saying it that it's pure entertainment is reductive in a way that does not match the evidence. And so, yeah, that point that you just made really resonates with me, and it's very much a part of my own journey and my own ongoing journey, like any projects that I'm moving towards. So I appreciate that. Um, what something I wanted to say about the social media side of things, make sure that again I'm tracking with you, is it seems that one of the problems with the continuous, right? Like it's important to have public moments of proving the authentic self, right? But this continuous proving is that there becomes this real temptation to that there's a continuous exposure to the temptation for hypocrisy.
Mhm,
That's a big one. It's like, oh, I need to make sure I'm matching the moment rather than matching me.
mhm.
And part of that is you're also not able to check in with yourself because you are so constantly focused on you have to create a cohesive identity without checking in with your true self, if that makes sense. So
Or
like
like
there is no
there's a fantasy of a cohesive identity. There's this idea that like I can keep track of the whole thing, and this is like, that I can't have conflicting or contradictory. I have to make the statement. Like I can't
Yeah.
just like see, wow, that situation is extremely tenuous and ongoing, and I'm not gonna like come out with my immediate take. Takes are like the opposite, that sense of and I think that's one of the things that I make a joke in the introduction about how hypocrisy is like the sin in the liberal order, right? And I draw from Arendt and Schlar on that, but like that sense that finding out someone's hypocrisy somehow feels like exposing sin in our culture,
Hmm.
and I use that loaded term. I just mean that, the secularization of it is that like you're exposing someone's sin for being contradictory to themselves. Um, and my students, they don't do this as much anymore, but would often tell me that Thoreau's mother did his laundry, which somehow negates everything he wrote. Everything he did. And I always come back with, like a modified version of something that Herman Melville says at the beginning of Moby Dick. He does this sort of locution a few times in the novel, but it's like, who ain't a hypocrite, right? Like there's
Yeah.
a sense in which there's this idea that we can escape hypocrisy.
Yeah. Well, and that's where maybe saying true self, and this is, so I'm glad I said
Yeah.
like I'm saying this because it's not true self, but it's allowing yourself time to breathe and reflect, so you can like even recognize within yourself when you have contradictions, instead of just being like, I need, like, flattening yourself to be cohesive. And that's like, so that's a better way of putting it. That's really helpful. Thank you.
I really like that idea that like what social media demands is a flattening of the self for cohesiveness or for coherence. Like that idea that what
Personal branding. Sorry.
Branding is a great example. Exactly. Branding is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. This idea that like you can come up with a package that's clear and coherent and shallow, right?
Easily
And
understood.
easily
Yes.
understood. I'm very bad at that. So I have like watched and studied and been like, how did you do that? I'm always like, why don't I talk about all these complexities so that like I make it a paradox upon a paradox upon a paradox? Because I can't like let those complexities go. But yeah, branding is a perfect example.
Yeah.
This
My
idea that
day
you can
job
be
is
a
digital marketing.
yeah, what? Oh, your day job is marketing. So
Yeah. So this is,
that's your
oh
goal.
man, I cannot tell you, as someone who does like philosophy, I'm like, this will work, but it hurts my soul that I'm telling you
Right.
this. And they're like, oh, that's great. And I'm like, oh my gosh. I'm just like, anyway, sorry. I just want to say, like, when you talk about like,
Who ain't a hypocrite?
yeah, okay. Yes, no, exactly. No, 100% that I literally, yeah, you know what? That's a whole rabbit hole. We don't
Yeah,
need to go down my frustration with that. But yeah, I feel that very strongly. I'm sorry, I cut you off, but
oh,
I just,
no, but that's
that
it.
was
So I
definitely a
was
spoke
about to
from the
say,
heart.
like, I'm very bad at that. That's also why I don't tweet a lot too, because like there is a genre to, like, I feel like, I'm just gonna say Twitter. But like, but that sense of when people are clever and funny on Twitter, it's amazing because it's a very it's a genre with brevity, so it lends itself to humor. But it is also a genre that lends itself to outrage and takes, it's all of those things at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah. I actually built an account on Twitter back a couple years ago, and I went to 6,000 followers in 3 months,
Oh, wow.
and most of it actually was asking questions that people responded to, which is
Mhm.
and then because people go on, what I figured out was people go on Twitter to give their opinions, and so if
Yes,
you ask good questions, people people respond, and it'll drive you up in the algorithm, which is
absolutely. Yeah.
horrific, because the opinions were terrible most of the time.
What were the
But
types of questions you asked?
I was trying to create a writer account. I was looking, I've been working on fiction. And so I was like, if you're going to be a writer, you have to have marketing. And so I started working on that. And I spent so much patience on Twitter that I was impatient with my family. And so I did that for 3 months, and I did not like who I was at home.
Yeah.
And I was like, so I deleted it, which to this day, I'm like, I guess it was worth it. Like this is where this is the capitalistic side of it, right?
Right.
You're like, but you had 6,000 followers, you got to keep it. And I'm like, it's not worth my family. And it's like that's a hard thing to say, right? It's like it's
But that's what I meant by
my
like
wife.
the paradoxes of privacy, right? There's Twitter is
Yeah,
obviously a public sphere, it's a type of public sphere. Although I always joked my main approach to Twitter was Twitter is not the public sphere because it actually is not a rational space for debate. So don't expect it. But it is a sense of you performing your authentic opinions and takes and outrages and emotions on Twitter, but that was actually affecting your private life. Right. And so that's what I meant by like privacy isn't this one thing, right? There's these like shades of like who I am privately, trying to say it publicly. There's the marriage and family and the private sphere. And then there's also that sense of selfhood, like what's happening in my head. Um, and I talk about that a little in the introduction because one of the complications of even just talking about the private is that economists will talk about it as like the marketplace, and feminist scholars will be like, okay, everything but the like government marketplace over there. The private sphere is like the home and women's domestic realm in the 19th century, the separate spheres ideology. So like we don't even have agreed upon definitions depending on which aspects of privacy we're talking about. As
yeah.
scholars and like talking across disciplines about privacy is really hard actually for that reason.
So this is something I wanted to ask you about, and I'm glad you said that because it reminded me. You talked about how marriage transformed from a public function to a private contract, and I think in our culture there's an immediate like, well, I know what I gained from that. Here's this question I'm interested in: what did we lose by transforming marriage from a public function to a private contract?
That's a great question, and I don't know if I have a good, clear answer. I mean, I'm really drawing on historian Nancy Cott there, who's brilliant. Her book on marriage is really helpful in thinking through this. I think one of the things that she says, so I'll ventriloquize her for a second, but like one of the things she says is that as marriage made this cultural and legal transition, the sense of what made a good wife or a good husband started to harden a bit. Started to be the boundaries stopped being as loose. I would say that by the end of the 19th century, and here I'm just speaking culturally, as divorce became more and more relatively more available, I just relatively more available. Um,
Understood.
yeah, but as it became an option, um, there's on the one hand, I think that's what the free love movement is arguing for, right? The ability to enter and exit relationships as they go. It's not what we think it is. That was what they were arguing for. But that sense that what is lost, I guess one of the things that gets talked about a lot in the late 19th century in that hardening and it is like a contrast, say, with France. This comes up so much. We joke about it in some of my classes, but authors like Carrie Beecher Stowe late in her career, and that's who I'm working on right now, so I'm thinking about her. But we'll always point to French marriages as the example of like what we don't do and what is the worst way to organize marriage, which is that like you had like women would have no freedom supposedly until they get married, and then anyone can have an affair. It's about that public facing marriage, but it doesn't matter what happens behind the scenes. Now, I'm not saying that's what French marriages were like. I'm saying that's how
That was the
that's
caricature.
that's the
Yeah.
American caricature of French marriages, and that sense that like a marriage as a public facing union where you can have separate lives, where you can be a woman who deviates from expected roles is less possible in the United States. Now, I would also say that this is very much a middle class version, a very like middle class version of marriage taking over the whole culture. So if you look at, say, 18th century, sort of like lower class, like marriages, weddings, that kind of thing, not weddings so much. That's really, I think of that as a very 20th century phenomenon. But that sense that, that like looseness around when you can have sex before marriage, stuff like that, that starts to harden as marriage becomes more contractual, as it gets caught up in both this liberal version of what marriage is, but also the way in which a sort of bourgeois middle class version of morality becomes pervasive. It just becomes part of our secular culture. Um, it shapes it. I mean, that's sort of the. I'm just borrowing that argument from Tracy Fessenden and John Modern, but that idea that the secular is really shaped by Protestantism in America.
Oh, did you say John Modern?
Yes.
Oh, I've had him on.
I know. I listened to it.
Oh, I was like, oh yeah. I was like, I know that
Yeah.
name. No, I really enjoyed having him on. I want to be respectful of your time. So one of the things I want to make sure we cover, because it's kind of the main thing, the way you frame it at the end of your introduction is privacy's sacredness. But I don't want to leave today without talking about the role that religion plays in kind of creating privacy,
Yeah.
and the way that these kind of religious origins or that sacred nature of privacy folds into domestic and life and personal life, like truly like that selfhood idea.
Yeah. That's both where I ended up, and it was a backwards walking, right? Watching this unwinding of any sort of set, like the sort of claim for religious freedom and the claim for reproductive or marital freedoms being pitted against each other. But that sense that one of the effects of lodging religion in the private sphere had to change how we thought about what the private sphere's function was. And I think that I had really kept trying to find other scholars who were sort of pinning down, like it's a narrative we tell all the time. The secularization was the movement of the religion from the public to the private sphere. And then there's a claim that women were in charge of morality and sort of it got feminized. But there's a way in which that doesn't necessarily explain how it is that privacy ended up having a moral function, right? I mean, and that's what I was most interested in, that sense that privacy and our private selves could not we're learning more scripts for moral sociability, moral sensibilities, such that you could I mean, it's a very, when you start to think about it, it's very weird to describe the private sphere or privacy, the right to privacy, as Warren and Brandeis do, as sacred. But that sense that that imbuing of it with a religiosity is part of that sort of movement of Protestantism into a sort of secular language. And I don't think they don't mean it like religiously at all. They mean it in a very secular way. But it still keeps with it a sense that it should not be touched. It should not be um, messed with. Now, of course, the trick with them is that they only mean a few people get this privacy, but as the chapter talks about, but that sense that um, privacy demands a certain type of moral orientation, just like your self does. And the self is the private self. It starts to concatenate. I feel like I'm getting too abstract, and I definitely feel like I always want to go to a literary example when I do that because it becomes too abstract. But I think the real insight of scholars of secularism is to really see that religion doesn't disappear, right, in the secular world. The secular and the religious are defined with and against each other, but that ways in which the dominant culture does religion is how both the religious and the secular get defined. So that's why it's different in different places.
So, I mean, and I think this goes back to our earlier discussion about deism. Of course, Locke claimed to be Christian, but that's like debatable. But some people say that's probably because he didn't want to get brought up on heresy charges, right? So we see some kind of like, really, like we're talking about the way that deism works out, in Locke, or, well, however you want to look, like this idea. There's definite metaphysical claims in this right to property. And there's, like, when you talk about the sacredness, what you're talking about, even this moral orientation, is that there is something deep rooted, like even sacred. All these things is that there's something abstract, but fully and firmly rooted in this privacy, right? And so it starts out. I mean, this is grounded in what? How does Locke make this claim? He makes this claim, talking about we are all made by God. And so if we're all made by God, we're all on the same playing field. And so that is a metaphysical claim that leads to his view on property, which leads to privacy, which leads to, and you could see like how it, which very grateful for some of the things that happen from it, but what are the long-standing ramifications that have happened from it, right? Like, there's always like these good and bad things. You don't see how the ramifications. I don't think he was sitting here and like, he's like, this idea of privacy is going to interact very strangely with social media, right? Like, that's not fair to put that on Locke, right?
No. How can you possibly know social media this way? I think though that, like, I mean, that's part of it, is like, why would anyone in an era, in a country that does not have an official state church, why would anyone care what anybody else does in their private lives? Right? And that's because privacy is not private in the US, right? Why would I care if you were married to somebody else that like that sense of, or if you needed to get an abortion, or like you use birth control, like why would I care? Is because privacy has a long-standing moral function. And that gets back to those 1790s deists. I think that, like, one of the things that can I say what drives me nuts in some of our
Go for it. Yeah.
discourse? As someone who like has studied the 1780s and 1790s and has this chapter on deism and fears around infidelity and atheism and sort of the conspiracy thinking, especially after the French Revolution, as I said earlier, I think that that use of a language of a sort of just a really very vague gestural Christianity that you see in, say, founding documents, like use of the word creator, right, is being willfully misinterpreted in our public culture to mean this sort of deep, like, Christianity to figures who, like, we're at best deists, right?
Right.
And I think, and that's why I think The Age of Reason by Paine is so fascinating, precisely because he writes it in this attempt to stop the French from going like full atheist. He's like, no, there's like reasons. But then it ends up just being, he's like, you should believe in natural religion, that sense of, a deist idea that miracles aren't happening now, but we can still kind of believe the Bible, like that kind of thing. Or, like you just take out all the miraculous stuff and you're still left with a moral code. And Jefferson, I mean, very famously cut out all the parts of the Bible he didn't like. And then, like, he had like the Bible he did, which had no miracles and no revelations, like that kind of thing. And I think that, like, that sense and that thick fabric of these religious fights and these fights over where religion should be located and why, so easily forgotten in our public culture.
Yeah. So I don't know if I mentioned it with John Modern. It sounds like the kind of thing come up, but I grew up independent fundamental Baptist.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So yes. So when you talk, like, I mean, we had the founding fathers, and I remember they were like, "You need to read these people." I'm like, "Oh, okay." And also, all these our country is thoroughly Christian. And then I actually was going to bring up, I was like, then you get to the Jefferson Bible, and you're like, I don't think you guys would like this guy. I don't think you've been checking up on your sources here. Like, and that's just a real part of it.
It is. And what's another group that really hated Jefferson, other than David Walker and sort of you Black critics of Notes on the State of Virginia, that at least in my field is more famous. Pro-slavery Southerners and pro-slavery writers in the 1850s hated Jefferson too. I mean, they just were like, Jefferson's not our man. right? Because of the all people are created free and equal sort of sentiment in the Declaration. They're just like, he's your guy. We don't believe in that, right? Um, I think it reminds what you said reminds me of the passage in Franklin's autobiography where he talks about reading anti-deist writing and then reading because the anti-deist writing would quote deists and he'd be like, well, I think the deists are right, like he was reading the thing that was supposed to convince him not to be a deist. And of course he also famously hid his deism for a long time, right? Just to because people had that reaction, right? Oh, are you even
Yeah.
Christian? But yeah, I mean, I think that the threat of unbelief, it waxes and wanes in our culture, but it's certainly waxing right now. But like that sense that like that's beyond the pale. Like we can all agree that you should believe in it in religion is central to how we interact in our culture. And I mean largely, and I'm making very broad generalizations, obviously, but yeah, I mean, I came to sort of looking at the history of religion because I was actually raised like Catholic. My mother's liberal Catholic, and and you just have a different way of inhabiting religion. Even if you're studying, there's intellectual traditions to Catholicism, but a lot of it when you're growing up is like sacraments and doing things with a group or embodied types of religious stuff. So it was and like if I were to say growing up who was like the figure that was like religiously most important for me, it would be like Mary, which of course is like not allowed in Protestantism. So it was interesting to start like realizing that in college, sort of seeing how the sort of Protestantism shaped how we talk even about secular things, like where does belief happen and why, and what kind of moral codes do you follow and why, and who gets to count as having a religion and who gets not to have free exercise of their religion. Yeah, no, that's sort of like the deep history, right? Of growing up New Jersey Catholic school.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're drawing to a close here. So one, I wanted to say thank you. It's been a real joy having you on today. If you could leave our audience with one thing to think about and kind of chew on throughout the week, what would it be?
I think it would be about that's a great question. I'll go sort of towards today and big questions rather than read some more books from the 19th century. They're great.
Yeah, let me say, besides reading your book, which everyone
No,
should.
not my book. Read the Scarlet Letter again. You'll love it as an adult.
I know. I got to plug your book, though. I got to plug. That's only fair.
Yeah.
I got to plug your book. Besides reading your excellent book, what should everyone do? Yeah.
I think to think about the compulsion and inefficacy of accusations around hypocrisy. We touched on that a little bit about like this sort of sense in which like hypocrisy is the one thing this sort of the way in which we do privacy doesn't want to allow for. My thought is partially like this impulse to say that person's such a hypocrite, as if that does moral work, and to think maybe about why we find disjunctions between public and private selves or contradictions so unable to account for, even when they are always on display and even part of our own, sense of life, right? So I would say, especially in our social media world and of course an extremely polarized nation dealing with, sort of like the sort of questions of politics that we deal with today. What does the desire to expose hypocrites do, and why is it not working as well as we kind of think it does? And I think part of that has to do is you have to believe that you need a full, authentic, in coherent self. But I would say that just thinking about hypocrisy more, that would be my thing.
And another way, because you immediately, love bringing it back to literature here at the end.
Yeah, well, thank you.
As thinking of Walt Whitman, right? Like, we need more people who are brave enough to say, do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict
Yes.
myself. I am large, I contain multitudes.
Yeah.
And just being like, yeah, that's me. I'm a hypocrite. Ain't we all hypocrites, right?
Yes, absolutely. I think Whitman's a great way to end, one of my favorite poets of all time. But that sense that that flattening that you talked about, that sort of like creating of the coherence, but the flattening of the self, that is part of branding. It's part of capitalism. It's part of expectations that I think are impossible, and therefore something for us to think hard about why we care so much, or
Yeah.
why we think it's effective even.
Well said. What a great way to summarize today. Dr. Murison, it's been an honor having you on today.
Thank you so much, PJ. It was such a wonderful conversation.